When people first heard that Mel Gibson was finally moving forward with a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, the reaction was basically a mix of surprise and curiosity. After all, the original movie came out way back in 2004, and for almost 2 decades there have been whispers about whether Gibson would ever make a follow-up. Now we know it's happening, and the film is set to be titled The Resurrection of Christ. Lionsgate is on board to distribute. Filming is supposed to start soon, and Gibson has already explained why it's taken so long to get here. According to Gibson, the main reason for the delay was the script. He admitted it took him about 8 years to write, not because he was procrastinating, but because the subject itself was so complex. The resurrection of Christ isn't just another biblical event you can cover in a straightforward way. It's deeply tied to theology, philosophy, and the entire narrative of salvation. Gibson said it was almost impossible to understand fully, which meant he had to spend years researching and synthesizing ideas from all over biblical history. Because of all that material, he finally realized the story couldn't be contained in one movie, it would have to be split into 2. That revelation changes everything. Instead of a single sequel, Gibson is essentially delivering a 2-part epic. He's even teased that exploring the fall of the angels in the beginning of time plays a role in setting up the bigger cosmic battle between good and evil. So it isn't just about showing Jesus rising from the tomb, it's about understanding why humanity matters in that eternal struggle. And that scope explains why Gibson kept calling it massive. Now, some might wonder whether audiences will respond to such a heavy theological film. But if we look back at the original, that movie wasn't exactly light viewing either, and yet it became one of the highest-grossing faith-based films ever, making over $612 million worldwide. So there's already proof that people will show up for something like this. Plus, the fact that Gibson funded the original himself shows how personal these movies are to him. This isn't a case of a studio forcing a sequel. It's something Gibson has been passionate about creating for years. Another interesting piece of news is that Jim Caviezel will return as Jesus. Gibson has mentioned using de-aging technology, the same kind used in films like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. That means audiences might see Caviezel both in his familiar role and in visions or flashbacks where he looks younger. De-aging tech hasn't always been perfect on screen, but if handled well, it could give this sequel an even more surreal and spiritual quality. But here's the big twist. Gibson isn't just making The Resurrection of Christ as a single release. He's planning to release Part 1 on March 26, 2027, Good Friday, and Part 2 only 40 days later on May 6th, which lines up with Ascension Day. Those dates aren't random, they're loaded with significance in the Christian calendar. And that decision tells us a lot about how Gibson wants this project to be seen, not just as a movie, but as an event tied directly to the faith it's portraying. It's a bold move. Usually, when studios split a movie into parts, they space them out over a year or 2. Think of Avengers: Infinity War and Endgame or the Dune films. But Gibson is shrinking that gap to just over a month. On one hand, that keeps the hype going without letting audiences lose interest. On the other, it does create a risk that some viewers might decide to wait until both parts are out so they can watch them together. That's the gamble Gibson is taking. This release plan has actually drawn comparisons to Kevin Costner's recent Horizon: An American Saga. Costner wanted to release multiple chapters of his Western epic only weeks apart. The problem was, the first movie flopped at the box office, so the second one was pulled from theaters before it even came out. Gibson's approach is similar in terms of scheduling, but the difference is that The Passion of the Christ already has an established audience. Faith-based films tend to perform consistently well, while Westerns have struggled in recent decades. So Gibson's gamble actually looks more likely to succeed than Costner's. And unlike Costner, Gibson isn't trying to launch an entirely new story universe. He's building on one of the most famous films in modern religious cinema. People already know what The Passion is, and many of them have been waiting years for the follow-up. That brand recognition alone gives The Resurrection a huge advantage. Another thing worth pointing out is that Gibson's sequel won't just focus on the historical or literal aspects of the resurrection. Instead, it's shaping up to be a kind of philosophical exploration. Gibson himself has said that the story asks questions like, why is mankind important? Why are the forces of good and evil fighting for us when we're so imperfect? That approach makes it sound less like a traditional biblical movie and more like a deep meditation on faith, morality, and humanity. And that could be exactly what makes it stand out. Even though there's always going to be controversy surrounding Gibson, especially considering his personal struggles and past scandals, it's hard to ignore the fact that he's still one of the few filmmakers willing to take this kind of risk. Most studios today are focused on franchises and superheroes, but Gibson is investing years into making a movie about theology. That alone sets it apart. And if we think about the timing, releasing The Resurrection of Christ in 2027 makes sense. It gives Gibson time to finish both parts, it lines up perfectly with Christian holy days, and it ensures that the two films can be marketed together as one giant cinematic event. That marketing angle alone could help make the project another massive box office success. Of course, there are challenges. Splitting one story into two films means asking audiences to buy 2 tickets instead of 1, and not everyone will be thrilled about that. But because both release dates are so close together, it won't feel like fans are being dragged along for years. Plus, there's a symbolic connection in the 40-day gap, which mirrors the biblical timeline from resurrection to ascension. That's the kind of detail that could make audiences see the release strategy as meaningful instead of just a cash grab. And let's be honest, faith-based films have been on the rise again in recent years. Movies like I Can Only Imagine and the God's Not Dead franchise have shown there's a hungry audience out there. With Gibson's name attached, plus the legacy of the Passion, the Resurrection could easily capture that market and more. So, will Gibson's sequel repeat Kevin Costner's Horizon gamble and flop? Probably not. In fact, it feels like the exact opposite. Where Costner was trying to revive a genre that's been struggling, Gibson is returning to a story that already proved itself globally. And by splitting it into 2 films released so close together, he's creating an event that could dominate spring 2027. And that's that for today's video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.